The stars were not a peaceful place. Anyone who had lived long enough in the outer reaches of the galaxy knew that. The darkness between worlds was full of danger, full of hunters, full of things that moved in fleets and left nothing behind but silence and smoke. The Vorkai had ruled those stars for 3,000 years. They were tall creatures, almost 3 meters high, with 4 long arms and hard shells that covered their bodies like armor. Their eyes glowed faintly, a deep orange color, like the last light of a dying sun. They did not speak much. They did not need to. Their actions said everything. When the Vorkai came to a world, they did not announce themselves. There was no warning, no message, no demand. Their ships simply appeared in orbit, massive, dark, shaped like the heads of hammers, and then the work began. They stripped the land of metals and minerals. They drained the oceans for chemicals. They took what they needed and left the rest to burn. If there were people on the planet, that was not their problem. If those people tried to fight, it made the Vorkai work slightly faster. That was all. 3,000 years. That was how long this had been going on. And in all that time, no species had stopped them. Not one. The Thalari had tried talking. They were a gentle people, amphibious, with wide silver eyes and a deep love of music and mathematics. They built beautiful boats and sang to each other across the water. When the Vorkai arrived above their world, the Thalari sent their greatest speakers up in a small ship, carrying symbols of peace in every form they knew. The Vorkai did not respond to any of them. Instead, they pointed a gravity weapon at the ocean floor and pulled. The seas boiled in less than 12 minutes. The Thalari were gone before their speaker's ship could even turn around. The Dranathi had tried fighting. They were old and smart, silicon-based creatures who had been traveling between stars for centuries before humans had learned to make fire. Their warships were enormous and powerful. They had weapons that could melt the surface of a moon. They had generals who had studied combat for their entire long lives. They assembled their greatest fleet, over 100,000 ships, and they flew straight at the Vorkai armada with everything they had. The Vorkai lost 4 ships. 4. The Dranathi lost all of theirs. And then the Dranathi lost their planet. And then they lost every colony they had ever built. In the end, the Dranathi were gone too, just like the Thalari, just like so many others. Word spread slowly across the galaxy, the way bad news always does. The Kalori, a small feathered species who communicated through complex patterns of song, stopped flying between worlds. They moved their people into the thick clouds of gas and dust near the center of the galaxy, where the Vorkai's sensors could not find them easily. They lived quietly in the dark and tried not to draw attention. The Muvari went underground, literally. They were long, soft-bodied engineers, patient in a way that most species found hard to understand. They had been building machines for thousands of years, but slowly, without hurry. When the Vorkai threat became undeniable, the Muvari simply disappeared beneath the surfaces of cold moons, digging deep tunnels, building in secret, waiting without any clear idea of what they were waiting for. The rest of the galaxy had reached a kind of tired agreement. The Vorkai were a fact of life, the way a storm is a fact of life. You could not fight a storm. You could only get out of its way and hope it did not notice you. On the edge of the galaxy, in a quiet part of the Orion Arm, there was a small star. Around that star, third from its warmth, there was a planet covered mostly in water. It had a single large moon and a sky that turned colors at morning and night. The creatures who lived there had only just begun to understand that other stars had planets around them too. The Vorkai's long-distance scouts logged the planet in their records. They used a simple code for planets like this one: pre-spaceflight biological, threat level negligible. The note said the planet might be worth collecting in 400 years, when its star system would have more resource value. Then the scouts moved on. The planet was called Earth. The creatures on it were called humans. The scouts did not look back. At the time, humans were arguing about borders and governments, and who owned which piece of land. They were building cities and writing books and making music. They were sick sometimes and hungry sometimes and afraid sometimes. But they were also curious in a way that was almost embarrassing, curious about everything, about animals and plants and rocks and the sky and each other. They asked questions constantly. They made tools to answer those questions, and then used the answers to ask more questions. They had not yet learned that the universe was watching. They had not yet learned that the universe was dangerous. They looked up at the stars and felt wonder, not fear. They pointed at the sky and made plans. In the Vorkai's vast empire, in the cold databanks where 1,000,000 worlds were catalogued and forgotten, Earth's centuries sat unread. 400 years, that was the timeline. Plenty of time. The Vorkai had never been wrong about a timeline before. They had never had a reason to be. In 3,000 years of reaching out and crushing everything they found, nothing had ever pushed back hard enough to matter. They did not know what was coming. They did not know what humans were. Nobody did yet, not even the humans themselves. But time was already moving, and somewhere in that small blue world at the edge of everything, something was beginning to stir. Laura Vasquez had not planned to become a soldier. She had planned to spend her life studying small things, single-celled organisms, chemical reactions in methane lakes, the kind of quiet science that most people never heard about. She liked the work. She liked the silence of it. She was 29 years old and 3 months into her research posting on Kepler's Reach, a small station orbiting a cold moon at the edge of explored space, when the Vorkai came. She did not see them coming. The station's sensors gave maybe 40 seconds of warning before the Vorkai patrol wing swept through the Kestrel Passage. And in those 40 seconds, the colony ship Endurance, which had been moving slowly through the passage, carrying 1,400 men, women, and children to a new settlement, was hit by 3 weapons at once. The ship did not explode dramatically, the way ships exploded in old movies. It came apart, quietly, in pieces, in the cold. Laura watched it happen through the station's viewport. She stood there for a long time after the pieces stopped moving. Then she went to work. The station had 43 survivors. Its communications array was partially broken. Laura was the ranking person alive, not because she had any authority, but because everyone with more authority was dead. She understood this without anyone telling her. She pulled the station's footage of the attack, copied it to 11 separate drives, encrypted each copy differently, and broadcast it on every frequency the station could reach. She did not know if anyone was listening. She sent it anyway. Someone was listening. The footage arrived on Earth 17 days later. It was not the first report of a Vorkai attack. Humans had been receiving broken, desperate transmissions from alien refugees for years, signals from species that no longer existed by the time the signals arrived, describing things that sounded impossible. Most people back home had found it easy to treat those signals as distant problems, things happening far away to creatures they had never met. Laura's footage was different. It was clear, it was close. It was 1,400 human beings. Defense Secretary Nathan Cole had been waiting for something like this. He was 61 years old, with short gray hair, and the kind of face that had stopped showing surprise a long time ago. He had spent 15 years quietly pushing for humanity to take the alien threat seriously, and for 15 years he had been told, in polite official language, that he was overreacting. He had never stopped pushing. The morning after the footage arrived, Cole walked into the United Earth Assembly Chamber and played it on every screen in the building, without introduction. Then he stood up. He said, "We have seen what is coming. Now we choose what to do about it." The vote took less than an hour. It was the fastest unanimous decision the Assembly had made in its history. The shipyards on Titan had been building exploration vessels and cargo haulers. Within 6 months, they were building warships. The same change happened in the fabrication caverns of Ceres, on the orbital platforms above Mars, in the deep construction bays of Luna. The work was not graceful. It was loud and hot and constant, running through every hour of every day, and the people doing it understood exactly what it was for. Engineer Petra Okafor had worked in spacecraft design for 9 years. She was methodical and careful, and not easily impressed by deadlines. But she also had a younger sister on one of the outer colonies. And after she watched the footage from the Kestrel passage, she stopped being methodical and careful about her hours. She started sleeping at her workstation 4 nights out of every 7. She stopped taking her full days off. She drew hull geometries obsessively, testing them against simulations of Vorkai weapons, throwing away designs that were not good enough, starting over. The design she finally finished, 3 years of work, hundreds of discarded versions, was a new class of warship. Compact, fast, with armor distributed in a way that deflected rather than absorbed, and weapon systems that could be reloaded faster than anything currently in service. She named the class after her grandmother, a woman who had survived 3 things that should have killed her, and talked about each one as though it had simply been a bad week. The first ship of the class rolled out of the Titan yard on a cold morning, and Petra stood on the gantry above the floor and watched it go. Her hands were shaking. She put them in her pockets so nobody would see. By the end of the 3rd year, there were 900 ships of that class. They called them Iron Wall destroyers. Training programs filled up faster than they could be built. Young men and women came from every part of Earth and every human colony world. Some because they felt they had to, some because they were angry, some because they were afraid and wanted to do something with the fear. The training was hard. The instructors did not apologize for making it hard. They knew what the graduates would be facing. A young man named Greg Harmon entered officer training during that first year. He was quiet, in the way that some intelligent people are quiet, not because he had nothing to say, but because he spent a lot of time thinking before he said it. He read everything the intelligence services had gathered on the Vorkai, their patrol routes, their fleet formations, their weapons, their history. He read about the Drenathi and how they had fought and lost. He read about every other species that had tried and failed. He did not read these records to feel hopeless. He read them to understand. He was looking for the pattern. He was looking for the mistake the Vorkai had been allowed to make, over and over, because nobody had ever been in a position to punish them for it. He found it. Greg Harmon was 44 years old when he was given command of Fleet Group 7. He was not the most decorated officer in the human military. He was not the loudest or the most confident-sounding. But the people who made decisions had read his tactical reports, and those reports were unlike anything anyone else was writing. They were calm and precise, and showed a deep understanding of exactly how the Vorkai fought. The Vorkai, Harmon had concluded, had one real weakness, not in their weapons, not in their armor, not in their numbers, which were very large. Their weakness was in their expectations. They had been winning the same way for 3,000 years. They expected inferior species to panic, to scatter, to try to protect their civilians and minimize losses. They had built their entire way of fighting around that expectation. Harmon intended to give them something they had never seen. The engagement at the Sharon Crossing was chosen carefully. A Vorkai enforcement fleet had been dispatched to process a human colony world, a standard operation for them, the kind they had run 10,000 times. 60 warships, an overwhelming force by any measure. They did not expect a fight. They expected a brief disruption, a few primitive defense platforms to swat away, and then the regular work of stripping a world. What they found was 612 human ships arranged in a formation that Harmon's team had spent 8 months developing. The formation was designed around one specific goal: to deny the Vorkai fleet the time it needed to adjust. Every element of it, the spacing between ships, the angles of approach, the timing of weapons fire, was calculated to be faster than the Vorkai's ability to respond. The Vorkai commander was a being called Grethvok. It was one of the most experienced officers in the Empire, with 400 years of campaigns behind it. When Grethvok's sensors resolved the human formation, it took approximately 9 seconds to understand that something was wrong. That was 9 seconds too long. The first wave of human fire hit, before Grethvok could finish issuing orders. Human weapons were not stronger than Vorkai weapons, but there were more of them, spread across a wider area, coming from angles the Vorkai formation had not prepared for. And the humans fought with a ferocity that the Vorkai's models had never predicted. Every simulation the Vorkai had ever run assumed that a species fighting for survival would hold something back, would try to protect its ships, preserve its forces for later. Harmon's orders said nothing of the sort. Every crew had been told the same thing: fight as if this is the last fight there will ever be, because for all of them, it might be. Pilot Casey Reyes was 24 years old and had been out of flight training for 6 months. She flew an interceptor, a small, fast ship meant to screen the larger destroyers from Vorkai fighters. In the first 10 minutes of the battle, she destroyed 7 enemy craft, took a hit that cracked her cockpit, and lost communication with her co-pilot, who had been knocked unconscious by the pressure change. She kept flying. She flew through the debris field of a destroyed Vorkai cruiser, threading between pieces of metal bigger than her ship, because the angle she needed to cover the destroyer on her left required going through it. She did not think about whether it was possible. She just did it. The battle lasted 47 minutes. At the end of it, 58 Vorkai ships were destroyed. 2 had escaped. Harmon had specifically allowed them to escape, ordering his ships not to pursue. He needed those 2 ships to go home. He needed them to deliver a recording. He had filmed everything. When Casey Reyes brought her damaged interceptor back to the carrier, the deck was already full of returning ships, and noise, and the organized chaos of a fleet pulling itself back together after a hard fight. She docked on memory and instinct, because thinking required too much energy, and her hands were doing the job on their own. The deck crew opened her cockpit, and looked at her, and then looked at each other. She was still holding the controls. Her knuckles were white. Her co-pilot, now conscious, was talking to her, but she was not hearing him yet. She was somewhere else still, in the middle of the debris field, measuring angles. They had to remove her hands from the controls, 1 finger at a time. She asked to fly again the next morning. Her commanding officer told her to take 11 days. She asked for 7. They settled on 9. The news of the Sharon crossing reached the rest of the fleet before any official report did. It moved the way good news moves among people who have been waiting a long time for it, fast and a little disbelieving, with a quality of something almost like relief, except sharper and louder. Ships that had been running on anxiety and discipline and controlled fear found something else underneath it. Not confidence exactly, something more basic than confidence. They had hit the Vorkai, they had hit them hard, and the Vorkai had broken. On the 2 surviving Vorkai ships, moving through the dark at maximum speed toward home, the crews transmitted their report in the clipped, precise language the Empire required. They described the human formation, the tactics, the weapons angles, the ferocity. They described 47 minutes and 58 ships. The Vorkai High Command received the report and read it 3 times. It was the first time in 3,000 years that an enforcement fleet had been destroyed. Not damaged, not turned back, destroyed. They decided to send 300 ships as a response, a punitive strike, a correction. They did not yet understand that they were no longer making corrections. They were in a war. The war lasted 9 years. That is a simple sentence, and it hides a great deal. 9 years is long enough for children to grow up, long enough for people to forget what peacetime felt like, long enough for the word normal to change its meaning completely. After the Sharon crossing, the Vorkai sent 300 ships to respond. It was the largest fleet they had dispatched against a single opponent in over a century. They expected to find the human fleet and end the question quickly. Harmon was not at the Sharon crossing when they arrived. What the Vorkai found instead was a ghost fleet, drone ships, electronic signals designed to look like engines and weapon systems. A handful of crude vessels whose only job was to move just slowly enough to keep the Vorkai formation tracking them. The Vorkai followed the ghost fleet into the debris field of the earlier battle. The debris field was full of mines. Harmon's engineers had spent 2 months placing them there. The Vorkai lost 217 ships. Humanity lost 41. After that, the Vorkai changed how they fought. They became more careful, more suspicious. They stopped moving in predictable patrol patterns. They started using scouts ahead of their main fleets. They adapted. So did the humans. The war spread across dozens of star systems. It was not always big fleet battles. Sometimes it was small, quiet things. Marine Captain Donovan Price spent 16 months on an occupied Kalori moon, leading a company of 80 soldiers through tunnel systems that the Vorkai had built under the surface when they took the moon 3 years earlier. The tunnels were dark and narrow, and full of sensors and automated weapons. Donovan's company fought through them room by room, sometimes corridor by corridor, losing people steadily the way you lose water from a cracked container. Not all at once, but constantly, until you are aware of it every moment. There were Kalori refugees in those tunnels too, the ones who had stayed when the moon was taken, hiding in the deepest sections. They were small beings, feathered and quick, and they had spent 3 years learning the tunnel system from the inside. They knew where every sensor was. They knew which corridors the Vorkai patrols use and which they ignored. They joined Donovan's company and became some of his best scouts. When Donovan finally reached the surface and raised the beacon that called in the fleet, his company had 14 people left. He recorded the names of the other 66 before he did anything else, standing in the cold air of the moon with the signal transmitting above him. He said each name out loud. Not all of the war was fighting. Most of it was not, in fact. Logistics Officer Marianne Tucker never fired a weapon in 9 years. Her job was to keep supplies moving: fuel, ammunition, food, replacement parts, medical equipment, across supply lines that stretched across 40 star systems. She worked from a desk on a station that was never entirely safe, managing schedules and inventories and the constant small crises of moving large amounts of material through space during a war. She slept less than she should have. She drank too much coffee. She developed the ability to hold 3 separate problems in her head at once and solve them in the right order. After the Battle of Kethera Station, when a resupply convoy was ambushed and destroyed, 3 fleet groups were left running on emergency reserves. Marianne had 19 days to solve a problem that should have taken 6 months. She solved it in 19 days by routing captured Vorkai fuel deposits through a relay system she built out of spare parts and old mining equipment, and 2 civilian cargo companies she contacted directly without going through official channels. It was not by the book. It worked. The other species of the galaxy watched the war with something that began as disbelief and slowly became something else. The Kalori came out of their nebulae, not all at once. They were careful, and they had reason to be careful, but in small groups, approaching human diplomatic stations with their hands open and their songs soft and exploratory. They brought detailed maps of Vorkai patrol routes that they had been quietly recording for generations. They brought knowledge of hiding places and weak points in Vorkai sensor coverage. They brought a fierce, quiet anger that they had carried for a very long time and had not known what to do with. The Muvari came up from their tunnels. They had been building things in secret for hundreds of years, slow, careful machines and systems that they had never had a reason to deploy. They offered these to the human fleet without ceremony, simply presenting them and explaining what they did. Some of what they offered changed the war in ways that did not become clear until later. Fragments of civilizations that the Vorkai had broken apart but not completely destroyed, finding each other and finding humanity, and deciding that this was the moment they had been waiting for, even if they had never quite believed the moment would come. Xeno Liaison Officer Diane Park spoke 6 alien languages by the 4th year of the war, and was learning a 7th. Her official job was to smooth communication between Human Fleet Command and the growing list of allied species. Her actual job was considerably more complicated. She mediated disputes between species that had old reasons to distrust each other. She explained human decision-making to beings who found it strange, and explained alien priorities to human commanders who were too busy to slow down and understand them. She made mistakes. Everyone did. She also prevented 3 situations from becoming disasters, each time by finding the thing underneath the argument, the real concern, the actual fear, and addressing it directly. The Vorkai could not understand the coalition. They had never needed to understand cooperation. Their entire history was built on the premise that divided species stayed divided, that a desperate species protected itself first, that no one would take risks for strangers. They kept waiting for the coalition to fall apart. It did not fall apart. The war was brutal and long, and it cost more than anyone had wanted to think about when it started. But it was moving. The Vorkai were being pushed back, slowly, system by system, in a way that had never happened to them before in 3,000 years. They had no word for it. They had to invent one. The Vorkai home system fell on a Tuesday. Most of the fleet found this oddly funny, later. Not funny in a joyful way, but funny in the way that strange details become memorable. The kind of thing people mention when they tell the story afterward. It was a Tuesday. The biggest thing that had happened in 3,000 years of galactic history, and it happened on a Tuesday morning. Admiral Greg Harmon stood on the bridge of the flagship and watched the final transmission come through from the Vorkai High Command. He had aged visibly over the 9 years of the war. His left arm ached in cold places. He had a scar along his jaw from a piece of debris that had hit the bridge during the Battle of the Outer Ring 2 years earlier. His hair had gone fully gray. The Vorkai transmission was long and formal. It used language that had no direct translation into human speech, something between an acknowledgement and a statement of fact. It said in the closest human equivalent, "The conflict is recognized as concluded. The Empire recognizes the current situation." It was not quite a surrender. The Vorkai did not have a concept for surrender. What they had was this, a formal recognition that the mathematics had changed. They were not going to say they were wrong. They were going to say that the situation was different now. Harmon accepted the transmission, recorded a brief formal response, and then sat down in his chair and was quiet for a moment. Around him, the bridge crew was quiet too. Someone started to say something, and then did not. The silence lasted maybe 20 seconds. Then someone in the back of the room started clapping, slowly, and then someone else joined, and then the whole bridge was loud with it, and out across the fleet, the same sound was happening in different forms, on hundreds of ships at once. Harmon let it go on for a while. Then he called for order and began the work of what came next. He was that kind of person. What came next was harder in some ways than the war had been. 3,000 years of Vorkai conquest had left wounds across the galaxy that were not going to heal by themselves. Whole worlds had been stripped of resources. Species that had once numbered in the billions were now a few thousand scattered survivors. Languages had been lost. Histories had been lost. Medicines and technologies and arts that had taken generations to develop had simply ceased to exist because the people who carried them were gone. Laura Vasquez, who was 41 now, and had finally finished her doctoral thesis in the second year of the war during a period of enforced station rest, was asked to head the Galactic Reconstruction Commission. She was not the obvious choice. She had no background in politics or administration. She was a scientist. She said this to the people asking her. They said, "We know. We want a scientist. We want someone who looks at what is actually there, not what should be there." She took the job. Her first act was to bring everyone into the same room, Kalori songkeepers and Muvari engineers and human architects and Dranathi descendants and representatives of a dozen other species, all of them with different ideas about what reconstruction should mean and different experiences of what had been lost. The meetings were loud and long, and sometimes almost broke down completely. Laura had a way of sitting through the loud parts without flinching, and then, when the noise had spent itself, asking a very simple question that somehow put everyone back on the same page. She was not a natural diplomat. She was simply someone who listened carefully and was not afraid of complicated answers. The reconstruction took decades. Everyone knew it would. The goal was not to finish quickly. The goal was to do it in a way that actually worked. Freed Kalori populations returned to worlds they had not seen in generations. In some cases there was nothing to return to. The Vorkai had taken too much and left too little. In those cases, new homes were built. It required help from species that had once had nothing to do with each other, working on the same problem side by side, making things up as they went, because there was no instruction book for this. The Muvari, patient as ever, contributed technologies they had developed over centuries in their underground tunnels, energy systems and material processors that turned out to be exactly what was needed for rebuilding stripped worlds. They gave these things without asking for much in return. When someone asked a Muvari elder why, the elder said, "We were waiting for the right time to be useful. The time has come." In the old databanks of the Vorkai Empire, buried under layers of conquest records, a historian found the original scout entry for Earth. Pre-spaceflight biological, estimated threat level, negligible. Projected collection timeline, 400 years. Someone had it printed out and framed. It was hung in the lobby of the new Interspecies Assembly Building in the capital city on Earth, in a plain metal frame with no commentary, no label, no explanation. Just the words. People stopped in front of it when they passed through the lobby. Some of them laughed. Some of them were quiet for a long time. A few of them took photographs. Casey Reyes visited the building 20 years after the war ended. She was a flight instructor now, running a school on a colony world that had been rubble when she first saw it, and was now a real place with streets and gardens and children who had grown up never knowing the war firsthand. She brought her students to Earth once a year as part of a history trip. She always took them to see the framed entry. She would stand in front of it and wait. Eventually one of the students, always one every year, would ask, "What does it mean?" Casey would look at it for a moment. The words were short. They took up very little space. Then she would say, "It means they saw us and did not look closer. It means they thought they already knew what we were. It means they were wrong." She always let the students think about that for a while, before she moved them along to the next part of the tour. Some of them were still thinking about it on the flight home. Out in the galaxy, in the space that had once belonged entirely to the Vorkai, new